So we're really excited today that we have Ric Rhinehart. Um, for over 25 years, Rick has held numerous executive positions across the tea and coffee industry. I don't think he needs an introduction, but just in case you've been living under a rock for those 25 years, Rick is an experienced professional with a demonstrated history of working in the hospitality industry and uh, has results to show for it. Most recently, he was the executive director of the Specialty Coffee Association for just over a decade. Uh, Prior to the SCA, Rick was COO of Groundwork Coffee Company, a specialty coffee roaster and tea purveyor in Los Angeles, California. Before that, he was the president of R2 Consultants. He also was a coffee and tea specialist at Cafe Olé. He's also worked at Four Seasons Hotel and Resorts in the food and beverage department. And if you have another 10 minutes, I could go through a list of more credentials, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to skip to the session that we're really excited for today. It's the State of Coffee 2020, this moment in time. Rick is going to talk about what's happened in our coffee industry and how did we get to where we are today. So with that, I'd like to invite Rick to take the stage and share your insights with us.
All right. All right. How's the audio?
Beautiful.
All right. Well, thanks for the kind introduction. And I want to really start by saying thank you to Abbas for the introduction, but also thank you to Damien for reaching out to me and asking me to be here today. And it's probably worth exploring that just a bit. I met Damien almost 10 years ago. I guess it must be 8 or 9 years ago now, in Panama at the Best of Panama competition, and started talking to him a bit about his venture producing coffee, and was really quite surprised to learn that he was producing coffee, but not in Boquete, not in Chiriquí province, but in an utterly different geography in Panama, one that is not a traditional coffee producer. And he just impressed me as one of those guys who is willing to take risks, to think outside the box, not to be too cliched, just to do something really different. And so when he asked me if I would be willing to participate in this conference, I love people who have that sort of fearlessness and willingness to try something totally outside their comfort zone. So that's how I got here. I said, yeah, sure, I'd be happy to do that. So I'm thrilled to be here. And thank you, Damien, very much for inviting me along. My job here today really is just to sort of contextualize where we find ourselves today within the sort of larger realm of where coffee's been over the last few decades, sort of what we might think of as the modern era. So I'm going to try and do that. But, I really couldn't even begin without acknowledging right out the gate where we find ourselves today. And I think did a fabulous job of sort of identifying the current reality and some of the tactics we might use to escape it. I want to step back and talk a little bit about that reality from my own perspective as a coffee person in the US, maybe a little broader global perspective, and then with a bit of a historical perspective of what we have seen in the past. So I'm going to put up a presentation here. There's my screen sharing bit, right? Let's see. And great, thanks. So this is me. This is what I want to talk about. So, this is that moment we keep talking about. We find ourselves in crisis, and it's not hard to define this as a crisis. I don't think anybody really anywhere has been able to sort of escape at least some interaction with the current reality and the impacts of what this coronavirus, this novel coronavirus, and the health issues it causes and the unknowns about it have caused. So we're in this place, and we have to ask ourselves, what do you do in a crisis? And the answer to that, it varies a bit. The people who are really thoughtful about this kind of stuff, have put lots of energy into, how do you manage a crisis? How do you define it? What do you do? Who are the shareholders and the stakeholders and the thought leaders who have to come together to really come to grips with what happens in the crisis? And we certainly have to be appreciative of those folks who have that kind of expertise, both from the medical and public health side of the picture to the policy side of the picture to the economic side of the picture. And it's fantastic that there are lots and lots of minds working on this at the moment. But the translation of that expertise into impact in our own lives on a very fundamental basis can be extraordinarily challenging. Probably the most recent sort of crisis of anywhere near this magnitude that will come to mind for anyone is the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009. And for those of you who lived through that in the coffee business, it had an enormous impact, and it was terrifying. And everybody who had these kinds of expertises in economics or in business or in policy tried to come together to face this down. Our own reaction from where I stood in coffee at that moment in time was to think about how to develop answers, how to answer the questions, how to face the unknowns in that moment in time. And we made a decision not unlike the one that Damien and the boss made, which was, hey, let's find the other people who are in this crisis with us, and let's talk about it. So we did this. This is a very old picture, and that's why the resolution is so bad. But we gathered together at the SCAA at the time about 400 of the sort of thought leaders that we could identify who had a huge stake in the coffee business, and particularly in the specialty coffee business in North America and then ultimately throughout the world. And our mission there was to share what we knew, what we didn't know, what our profound questions were, what our thoughts were about how we might move forward, what our strategies might be, and in some respects, what our tactics might be. And we were there anchored around a group of presenters who presented some thought-provoking questions and some potential solutions and some market assessments. But most of the work was done in the conversations between attendees, where we could identify what our common challenges were, what our thinking was about how to address those challenges, and to be inspired, to be prompted by, to begin new ways of thinking, to gain new perspectives, and to start to formulate those plans to move forward. And so this effort today is very much like that. And what I hope to do today is to encourage you, A, to take those prompts and let them stimulate your thinking. B, to open the dialogue with the speakers and more importantly with the other folks attending. And C, to continue to foster that kind of collaborative dialogue in every part of your life. As you're looking at how to face down this crisis, how can we keep those conversations alive? How can we inspire and stimulate and encourage each other to find those solutions? How can we be a collaborative group of folks in the world and move this forward together? So I'd encourage you to open your perspectives a bit and be ready to talk, not to me and the speakers, which you're welcome to, but make sure you're ready to talk to each other and the other folks around you. This crisis, of course, is a little more profound than the economic crisis, the global financial crisis was, not solely for the scope of the economic damage, but because it is damaging at such an intense level for the health of so many people. This is quite unique in my lifetime. We haven't seen this kind of global pandemic since the early part of the 20th century. Scientists and public health professionals have told us that this is going to happen. We knew somewhere along the line it was going to happen. But if things don't happen in your lifetime, the fact that the threat exists sort of starts to get backgrounded for you. So we are jarred into a new reality by this manifestation of a threat that we knew was possible. And so we have to be very conscious of that. We have to be thoughtful that this particular crisis crisis is very different from crises we've faced in the past. It has many, in fact, nearly all of the challenges of the economic crisis a decade ago, with the added complications of a tremendous amount of new unknowns. And I think the thing to be thoughtful about here is that the unknowns we're facing here are not only unknown at this moment, but may be unknowable for a long time into the future. So all the plans that we make, all the thinking that we have about how to progress in the current situation are going to be influenced by as yet to be discovered attributes of this virus and of its impacts on our health, and of how it spreads, what the risks are, what the possible solutions are in terms of vaccination or medical treatments, et cetera. So that series of unknowns will undoubtedly impact us all as we go forward. I'm going to step back into the narrow rather than the broad, and take a look at coffee specifically. Very well illustrated in Karthik's presentation is coffee tends to be a relatively resilient product, tends to be relatively price inelastic, and consumption tends to be relatively inelastic. And in fact, that's sort of what's played out here. It played out very much this way in 2008, 2009, is that overall coffee consumption had a moderate downturn, but not a profound one. And what really shifted was the venue of consumption. So the place of consumption for specialty coffee has undoubtedly been principally out of the home, principally in cafes and coffee houses. And in 2008, 2009, the consumption venue shifted, but it was a very temporary thing. The venue shifted principally because of people's economic concerns. Today, it's really dramatically complicated by people's health concerns. So the need to be socially distant has had a tremendous impact, obviously, on the cafe and restaurant and hospitality sector, and that is very profoundly felt for coffee. The good news underlying that is that the consumption has stayed relatively strong. The venue of consumption has shifted to the home. There has been some downward trading in coffee quality. Consumers at the initial outset of stay-at-home orders and quarantines drove them to convenient, recognizable brands, principally off of supermarket shelves. It's early for us to be able to get this data because it's hard to acquire, but here in North America and in the US in particular, we have good anecdotal evidence that this time specialty consumers seem to be moving their specialty preference into the home with them. So online sales and curbside sales from specialty coffee roasters have moved into the home fairly effectively. So the specialty coffee roasters and cafes who had a good platform for online sales and remote access to their cafes have done relatively well here. And we've seen that sort of throughout in talking with green coffee traders. The initial shift was to move a lot of coffee, both off spot and forward, into the hands of large commercial roasters. But after that initial sort of hoarding and panic purchasing that took place in consumer packaged goods on grocery store shelves, we've seen people start to access new ways of acquiring specialty coffee and transferring their specialty coffee habit into the home. So lots of home brewing devices, traditional and unique, have seen spikes in sales, and we've seen lots of people trying to figure out how can I recreate that specialty coffee experience, at least from a gustatory experience in my home, so I don't, in this period of time when I can't visit the coffee house, I can at least have great coffee in my home. And there's been a tremendous amount of that. And we've seen it sort of throughout in North America in particular. We've seen it sort of throughout the domestic approach to food and beverage. Folks who spend a lot of time eating great food outside of their homes now find themselves trying to get ready to prepare meals from their favorite restaurants. We're finding access to other ingredients, or the most sort of famous meme here in the US is the number of people who have started baking their own bread, which is a fantastic return to a relatively simple task. But it's indicative of people's desire to have those things that they prized before the current crisis still be possible for them. So to that degree, this current crisis, although in many ways much more challenging than the 2008-2009 financial crisis, has had some bright spots. We have seen more transfer of specialty coffee habits into the home, and not just a change in venue. I would note, by the way, that one of the things that makes specialty coffee special, one of its many attributes, is not purely the organoleptic or gustatory experience of drinking a great cup of coffee. Part of the experience of coffee is the ambiance, the environment, the opportunity to share time and space and thoughts, and the warm act of consuming coffee with others around us. And that's a thing that's very hard to transfer into the home. And that's the thing that provides, I think, some optimism for the future of specialty coffee in the cafe environment. I'm going to shift gears now and go back and talk about something that, if you look at the dates on this slide, I think it's worth noting. This is the sort of oldest set of slides I could find in my own collection of slides that I've made to look at the topic I want to address right now, which is what's the situation for coffee as a global marketplace. So we'll start here at the top of it, which these are the figures from 2012, looking backwards to the beginning of the millennium. And it's a balance of production versus consumption. And you can see, if you sort of take a look at the smooth line there, that production and consumption have been more or less on the same trend line and have been more or less in parity. There's been years where there's more production than there's consumption. There's been years when there's more consumption than production, but the general trend has been towards parity, which means that the demand growth has been relatively steady and the production growth has been there to meet it. So that's been generally a good trend for coffee. And if you looked at the numbers extended out to the 2019-20 crop year, you're going to see many of the same things, this sort of general parity between production and consumption. And that's, from the macro point, that's a good thing. The outlook for the current crop is that while consumption is likely to be down overall production is also likely to be just a bit higher than overall consumption. So we're going to see a market in which there's probably slightly more coffee than market demand will take up, but that demand is not likely to be profoundly lower than the production. It remains to be seen what the final impacts on coffee production are, not only from the financial perspective, but much more importantly from the human perspective. How much will we have access to labor? What will be the logistical challenges? What will consumption in producing countries be like? Will it continue to grow? Will consumption in emerging economies continue to grow at the pace it has been? Brazil released a statement 2 or 3 days ago that domestic consumption in Brazil, and Brazil is the second largest consumer in the world, was off by something like 30% in April. Now that seems that seems fairly hard to swallow from where I sit, but it's an unknown that we'll have to look for more information as we go forward. How will domestic consumption be impacted in producing countries and non-traditional consuming countries? This is a forecast for consumption that, again, this dates back to 2012. You can see the starting date of this, and it predicted that by 2020, in the sort of highest, most aspirational, most optimistic views of consumption, that we would reach levels of about 155 million bags of total consumption worldwide. We have blown through that trend line. Actual consumption worldwide is somewhere north of 165 million bags. So consumption has been quite strong in the period between 2012 and now. That growth has been profound. Likely we're going to slow down. That trend is going to slow down a bit. It remains to be seen where and how it will slow down and to what degree it will slow down, and really for how long that slowdown will continue. Nonetheless, it looks like overall consumption in the current year is still likely to be strong at 160 million bags, or potentially a little better than that. This is a slide, and again, this is why I went back in time. I really wanted to see the first time that I presented this particular data anywhere. And this is the earliest version of this that I could find. I may have presented it earlier, but this is again this is me going the wrong direction. Sorry. This is a look at the price trend between 2010 and 2013. And we could see what was happening there. Prices had spiked in 2011 on the basis of a shortfall in Colombia that had really come to roost in the market. And we could see that as that coffee started to return to market, as Colombia started to produce again in quantity, prices started to drop fairly rapidly. At the bottom line, that yellow line is actually a look at what was going on in the London markets, in the Robusta markets. And you can see, while there was a downward trend in price, there was not the same kind of accelerated change, not the huge spike that we saw in New York. And this is an important thing to note. We're seeing something not dissimilar. As noted in 2018, we reached some extraordinarily low prices. In August 2018, the New York market was well below $1, which is the first time it had happened in over a decade. We've seen prices have some rises and falls. We got up around the $1.30 level in the early part of this year, but we've continued to see a downward trend in New York and a downward trend in London. This overall downward trend obviously has huge implications for producers, and it raises many of the issues that we have had to confront on a cyclical basis about how coffee pricing is reflected in commodity markets. This next slide is sort of the crux of that biscuit. If you take a look at this, what you can see, and again, these trend lines are very much the same today as they were a decade ago. Over the course of the last 30 years, coffee production in the world has jumped from somewhere around 80 million bags in total to this 165 million bags of production that we see today. But what's critical to note is essentially 100% of that growth in production has occurred in natural coffees, and principally in natural Brazils, natural Arabicas, and in Robusta coffees. So the Robusta growth and the natural Arabica growth has been essentially 100% of that growth. The production and consumption of washed Arabica coffees, of what the futures market classifies as milds, has been essentially flat. It's been hovering around the 40 million bag range for more than 3 decades now. It's had some ups and downs. It's been as low as 31 or 32 million. It's been up slightly over 40 million, but it's been a relatively narrow band, and it continues in that band. And this is worth noting because some of the impacts we're seeing in the marketplace today are driven by this behavior. For most of us in the specialty coffee world, washed milds are a proxy for specialty coffee. This is, by the way, not meant to suggest that there aren't great specialty natural coffees. There are, but in terms of global trade, the numbers we're talking about really are a division between washed Arabicas, natural Arabicas, and Robustas. And we're seeing this trend continue. Washed Arabica production is still severely challenged. The impact of all of this is that you get a marketplace where prices are low because overall supply is high. So we have lots and lots of coffee writ large, more coffee than probably the world can consume, but relatively tight supplies of washed Arabica coffees. That changes the activity of the market in a couple of ways. One is, even though it's hard for us to buy those great coffees, hard for us to find those washed Arabica coffees, overall market prices tend to diminish because the overarching supply of coffee, the coffee that meets the needs of commercial roasters, that meets the needs of the soluble producers, that meets the needs of the world's thirst for coffee as a caffeine carrying beverage, there's plenty of coffee. Much less coffee available, and essentially no growth in the washed Arabica category. The outcome of that scenario is what we're seeing in the marketplace today. While the market basis price is quite low, the the differential price for quality is continuing to increase, and it continues to increase at a fairly dramatic pace. This is particularly dangerous for a number of reasons. One is that it makes it very hard to do any kind of price risk management if you are on the production side of it. So whether you're a smallholder aggregated into a cooperative, or whether you're a larger farm, whether you're an exporter, the opportunity to put in sophisticated price risk management tools, no matter what your access to finance is severely impacted by the balance of final pricing determined by the differential versus the basis price. So this is creating a new set of challenges, and it's one that we've seen before. It will ultimately break, and when that happens, there will be a lot of financial pain for folks who are not able to adequately hedge. So this problem will get worse before it gets better, I'm afraid. We have seen buyers trading down a bit, definitely at the outset of this. As I said, people went to the grocery store, they went to the supermarket, and they bought the brand that they knew in the past. That is definitely a trade down in quality. On the bright side, we're seeing people start to return to the marketplace, not going to cafes necessarily, but getting into specialty coffee in the home consumption market through the more successful specialty roasters, those who have presented easy access. Uncertainty is still the biggest problem here. The unknowns are still profound. When will we reemerge from quarantine? It's a country by country and a region by region question. Here in the US, it's a state by state and perhaps even county by county question. But what is really profoundly unknown is, will this virus have a resurgence? Will we see an uptick in transmission again? Will we be able to cope with that? If it happens, what will those impacts be? Will we see another constriction of economic activity as a result? These are very unknown. Until we have a longer term solution in terms of a vaccination or a viable medical treatment option, uncertainty, those unknowns around the risks of this virus are going to continue to have extraordinary impacts on the marketplace. Climate change remains. We'd like to think that we have the liberty to focus all of our attention on the current crisis, but the overarching looming crisis that is climate change in the background continues to create profound risks with uncertainty in weather patterns, with unusually intense climatic conditions. Those things are going forward in the background. The planet continues to react to our machinations on it in profound ways, and our attention seems to be quite limited there. And then, in spite of massive infusions into the markets, it has been and remains challenging for small businesses, for producers, for high-risk activities like coffee farming to get access to finance, and that will continue to be a problem. You may have the thought to get out and open a unique kind of coffee venue today, but access to the capital to move in that direction will be limited by the risk aversion that is typical in a crisis scenario. All of these problems continue to exist. Solutions to them will have to come over time, but we need to be well aware of these potentials and these ongoing risks. And finally, one of the things about a crisis is that it creates new opportunities. And I think Karthik did a great job of looking at some of the tactical opportunities that will arise on the other side of this, or even during this current crisis. I'd suggest a few others that are worth thinking about in a more strategic sense. First and foremost is there's room for new business models. There's no question that the current environment has made us have to look at the challenges of the existing business models throughout the coffee economy, both at the production level and at the consumption level. The cafe model of the past may not be a viable, and likely not to be a viable model for the future. The farming model of the past may not be a farming model for the future. And there's great work happening out there on this approach to business. We've seen the beginnings of a fairly robust movement towards vertical integration from producers and downward vertical integration from traders and roasters. Lots of ripples in that arena. I have the pleasure of working with a really sort of forward-thinking Ethiopian farming group at Matad, who have focused on quality, but have also focused on changing the business model so that their production and their access to technology, their access to all the steps of production in producing great quality green coffee are shared outward with outgrowers in the vicinity of their principal farming operations. And I think we've seen a number of these kinds of collaborative business models beginning to spring up, not only in Ethiopia, but we see potential in other parts of East Africa. We see potential in South America, and ultimately we will see these possibilities arise around the world of coffee. The next opportunity to me is that consumers are really braced for some sort of new normal. I don't think it's possible to have a conversation today about our current reality and our future reality without having a general consensus that whatever the future is going to look like, it's going to look different than the past looked. And there's no question that people will have to make accommodations of all kinds, but from those accommodations, there's an opportunity for change. There's an opportunity to do new and exciting things. And understanding how the consumer of the future will take their place in the coffee value chain will be a key to successful business going forward. Also, technology continues to move forward. Technology continues to grow and change how we approach the world. Witness the thing we're all engaged in here today. The Zoom conference, Zoom call is ubiquitous in the environment today.